From Rogan having Dana's back even during his slap controversy, to the UFC boss branding Rogan as the greatest combat sports commentator ever, here's what Joe Rogan and Dana White really think of each other. Sure, they've been friends for over 2 decades now, but Rogan's loyalty to his boss knows no bounds, and despite White slapping his wife and wreaking havoc all over the world, he stands by his friend as his biggest supporter. In a video that spread like wildfire on Twitter, White got into a fight with his wife, Ann, during a New Year's Eve bash in Mexico. The UFC boss leans in to say something to Ann, and she responds with a slap, but the show doesn't stop there. White retaliates by slapping her back, not once, but twice. The people around stopped the matters from escalating, but the video was enough to send half the world into angry fits. There was an outcry for White to step down from his role with UFC, but when Rogan was asked about his opinion, the man didn't utter a single bad word about White. During his podcast, Rogan passionately explained cronyism and how it affects his friendship with Dana. He mentioned how if anyone came to him with criticism for the UFC president, he would simply tell them to go elsewhere. Joe considers him his brother and cannot imagine saying a single bad thing about him. I mean, if he didn't know who Dana was, he would have had some negativity to point out, but he loves the man a bit too much for that. Rogan announced that he can never be objective when it comes to his friends, because while he won't lie about them being good people, he would never badmouth them. I'm sure you're sitting there, wishing for a friend like Rogan, but these two didn't just become buddies out of nowhere. These two go all the way back to 2001, and at the time, they were nothing more than work buddies. Rogan had already dipped his toes into the UFC world back in 1997, but 2 years later, he decided to walk away. Trust me, he had the right reasons, because the money he was making from UFC was nothing when compared to the fat stacks he was raking in from his stand-up comedy gigs. Fast forward to 2001, Dana and Joe crossed paths for the first time ever. Rogan was attending a UFC fight and had a super interesting conversation with White as they discussed fighters, techniques, and the thrill of the sport. Now, Rogan had no idea that this conversation would change the game forever. Dana instantly made him an offer to commentate for UFC fights. And while it was tempting, Rogan declined. For him, his love for the sport was only as a fan, but White was bent on it and finally convinced Rogan to give it a shot. His first fight turned out to be UFC 37.5, which featured a legendary clash between Chuck Liddell and Vitor Belfort, and he loved the experience so much, he decided to hop aboard for good. So all thanks to Dana, Joe Rogan got the space to grow into the most brilliant commentator. No wonder he's so loyal to his UFC boss. But the podcast host is a man who speaks his mind, and when it comes to his opinions on Dana's risky ventures, it's no different. Joe isn't into Dana White's Power Slap League, and he's not scared to talk about it. In the Joe Rogan Experience, he confessed that slap fighting isn't his cup of tea. Instead, his real passion lies in the heart of traditional MMA fighting. He's into the problem solving that comes with his favorite UFC fights, and nobody can deny that fans are on the edge of their seats, waiting for the fighters to pull their next move. He's all about the likes of Sean O'Malley and Piotr Jan's brilliant technique, but that's not all. He painted a picture for his listeners, staging a fearless Russian assassin charging forward, while his opponent sidesteps, throws jabs, and dances away. For Rogan, that's what it takes to truly excite the audience. But there's more. While talking to Corey Sandhagen in his podcast, he brought up kickboxing and how it's something that fans all over the world enjoy. But the discussion clicked an idea into his mind, and he said that if he was running the UFC, he wouldn't even want to look into slap fighting. Instead, he'd put all of his focus on pro kickboxing. Now, this definitely sounded a bit shady, with Rogan implying that he could make better decisions than Dana, but his opinion is no betrayal to the UFC president and his slap league. Despite his feelings about slap fighting, Rogan admitted that he'll definitely tune in to watch Dana's creation. After all, friendship comes first, and considering how he's a bona fide combat fanatic, he can probably find a way to enjoy it. While Rogan has some strong opinions, his bond with his buddy wins over everything else. In fact, he made a startling statement in 2022 saying that he would leave the UFC if Dana White left. As it turns out, the Rogan-White duo is a full-on package deal. In his podcast, Joe mentioned that if Dana leaves, he's gone. And trust me, the man sounded very serious about it. Sure, everybody knows that the two have their own bromance going on, but Rogan's career is no joke. For over 2 decades, he has been at the UFC's broadcast desk, blessing it with his commentating talents. Now, at the age of 56, he's been working fewer events, but his impact is still stronger than ever. Here's the kicker, though. As long as Dana White stays the UFC president, Rogan isn't gonna budge an inch. But as soon as Dana's gone, he's gone too. That doesn't mean that his career will come to an end, because only 3 years ago, in 2020, he got a deal with Spotify worth $100 million for his podcast. So even if he leaves the UFC with White, one thing's for sure: Rogan isn't running short on money anytime soon. From the looks of it, the duo is inseparable, to the point where they share almost everything with each other. Dana recalled an event where Joe Rogan had the time of his life, and he seemed excited for the guy. In 2022, Rogan attended the Qatar vs. Emmett UFC Fight Night, and usually he goes in as the commentator. But guess what? This time, he went in as a watcher. He enjoyed the entire fight through the stands, accompanied by his family. And when the camera panned to him, the fans shrieked with excitement. Now, this was the first time in 20 years that Rogan became part of the audience. And considering how he was a giant UFC fan before being a commentator, you can imagine how much fun he had in the stands. Dana had the most wholesome reaction to it, and when he was asked about it, he mentioned how Rogan hasn't done that in 20 years. He knew that it was his friend's first night back as a fan, and without any judgment, he was simply happy for the guy. He confirmed that Rogan had a blast, and the boss had no issues with it. In fact, nobody understands Rogan's craving for real-time fighting better than him, because he feels the same way. The two have so much in common that it's hard to give a name to their bond, and the UFC fan base had an interesting theory. A lot of people thought that Rogan and White were brothers. Right off the bat, the two are not related, but they definitely look like they are. I mean, they're incredibly close to each other and turn up to events together all the time, but that's not all. They're both bald and have very similar builds, and both of them love MMA equally. But while you'd love to see them as brothers, they cleared the rumors themselves. Joe and Dana both stated that they're not related by blood, but they consider each other brothers from another mother. In fact, they even publicly refer to each other as brothers sometimes. In an Instagram live chat from 2019, you can see them both greet each other, as White starts off with, "What's up, my brother?" while Rogan replies with, "Hey, brother." If you're wondering how they get along so well all the time, the answer lies in one simple fact: they both have a lot of respect for each other, and I've got proof. Dana considers Joe to be the greatest commentator out there, and he's not wrong. Now, I've talked plenty about Rogan's respect for his UFC boss, but it's not all one-sided. Dana feels the same way about Rogan, and while talking to him a couple of years ago, he said that he loves the way Rogan breaks fights down. But wait, there's more. The legendary commentator has a unique way of looking at the fights, and Dana's all about it. After all, he's the mastermind who saw the potential in Rogan. And as though complimenting his own eye for spotting his talent, he branded Rogan as the best combat sports commentator of all time. That's a pretty massive compliment, but a well-deserved one, because some of the craziest UFC fights are masterfully commentated by Rogan himself, all thanks to Dana's constant support for the guy. So there you have it. From White declaring Rogan as the best commentator in the world, to Rogan refusing to criticize the UFC boss on his slap controversy, that was what Joe Rogan and Dana White think of each other.